Okie dokie. Welcome back. This is Chapter 9, Section 2, Nationalism and Sectionalism. This is kind of our ism chapter here. And we're going to talk about what these two words mean. And you're going to find out that they really are, they're very, very much so opposite one another, or they can have an opposite meaning. Growing nationalism led to improvements in the nation's transportation systems. Now, before we can talk about transportation, we need to first talk about what does this word nationalism mean. Nationalism, feelings of pride and loyalty to a nation. That makes sense because if we look at, the word nationalism, you see nation is in that. And so feelings of pride and loyalty. In other words, you are proud that you are part of that country. And so it says growing nationalism, so feelings of pride and loyalty, led to improvements in the nation's transportation system. And a lot of these ideas are going to come from a man named Henry Clay. Now, we've already talked a little bit about Henry Clay in last chapter, and if you remember, Henry Clay was a war hawk. Okay, he was one of those young Republicans who really wanted to go to war with Great Britain, and actually he got his way because remember, we did go to war, and I told you back then that we were going to hear a lot about him. Henry Clay, he served as a U.S. representative from Kentucky, so he was part of the House. He was also a senator. He ends up becoming Speaker of the House and Secretary of State. What you'll notice is not on there is he is not ever the president, but the poor guy runs a zillion times, and he just never wins. So as we continue to watch these chapters, look and see how many times Henry Clay's name is on the ballot. There he is right there. He is a big supporter of nationalism, pride in the nation. And he developed the American system, which we're going to talk about today. He was all about preserving the Union, and he did that in quite a few compromises. Henry Clay, his nickname, we could call him a.k.a. the Compromiser, okay, because he frequently, when people couldn't decide on things and one side wanted one and one side the other, he would step in and find a way to compromise. Specifically in this chapter, the Missouri Compromise. But first, let's talk about him and the American system. The American system was a series of measures, or in other words, ideas, to make America economically self-sufficient. We talked last chapter that while land didn't change hands at the end of the War of 1812, we did have some positives. One was that America was more patriotic. America also became more manufacturer-based. Before we always had Britain do it. Now we started during the War of 1812 doing it ourselves. So we want to be self-sufficient. Now self-sufficient, you see two words, self, in other words, on our own. If somebody is sufficient, that means they can survive. So to be self-sufficient is you can survive, S-U-R-V-I-V-E, on their own. So we want the United States to be economically self-sufficient, to be able to survive on our own. So the first one is that we want to have that national bank to provide a single currency. I mean, could you imagine if every time you went to Ohio you had to change money? It makes interstate trade and travel easier, so that national bank. Next one is to improve roads and canals. Now that's going to take money. I mean, even today when we improve roads, not so much canals, but when we improve it, it takes money. And so we are going to use a protective tariff, which we talked about a couple chapters ago, so that people will buy American goods, and if they don't, that money can be used for roads. We'll talk more about these roads a little bit later on. Some in Congress, though, felt that this was not allowed, and if you can guess who that is, I'll give you a second. Guess who in Congress, or also famous people, thought this was not allowed? Think strict construction. If you said Jefferson and Madison, you would be correct. They were really not fans of this because, they believed in that strict construction. But, Henry preached on the fact that this really is going to be what's best for the nation. Okay? They said, hey, please make sure that this is going to be really what's good for the nation. Others said, hey, this is just going to help out the wealthy. And Clay tried to express, no, this was going to help out the nation. He said, hey, it's worth trying it, and Congress actually agreed with Clay. And so the American system was put into place. The big one that we're going to focus on this chapter is roads and canals. Now, roads. The Cumberland Road was the first federally built road. It was also known as the National Road. National Road. Okay, first federally built. In other words, the federal government built it. It started in Maryland in 1850 and actually went all the way to Illinois by the time 1815, and stretched to Illinois by 1850. If you look, here's a map. If we look, here is Cumberland right here. Okay, here's Cumberland. Runs through Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, runs through Ohio. You can see Columbus, Springfield. It actually eventually also ran through Indiana. There's Richmond, Indianapolis, Terre Haute, and then it made its way all the way, like we said, to Illinois. And it continued on to Jefferson City. But Illinois was many times considered its final stop. That's the Cumberland Road, or also known as the National Road. Now, early on, most roads were pretty much, in the early 1800s, they were mostly dirt or they were crushed stone. They were normally about 66 foot wide. They went through forest. There wasn't a whole lot of bulldozing going on, so you kind of had to weave your way through forest. So the fact that we had one national road that actually was bulldozed out, again, it wasn't, asphalt like we have today. It was still that dirt and crushed rock. But the fact that it was one continuous road was huge for back then. And next we're going to move to canals. Basically, a canal is a man-made river. Okay? River transportation was great. The problem with river transportation is that most rivers went north-south. Okay, very few rivers went east-west, especially in the east. Okay, now like where we live, the Ohio River, we know that goes east-west. But in the east, not very many rivers did go that way. And so we wanted to build these water transportation because what it did is it made it cheaper to transport goods. And so we built the Erie Canal. It ran from Albany to Buffalo in New York. And it allowed both goods and people to move from the East Coast all the way to towns on Lake Erie. If we look at, I have a couple maps here for you. If we look and see how does it connect the East Coast, well, if you look down here, here's the East Coast runs through here. You can take the Albany River up, and then, oh goodness, I'm sorry. Let me go back. You can take the Albany River up. Okay, let me try this again. Apparently it's not going to let me go back, but the Albany River the Hudson River, runs right through here, and then this is the Erie Canal. You can see the different stops along the Erie Canal, and, Rochester, you've heard of that. Schenectady, you may have heard of before. And then it takes you all the way to Lake Erie right here, which Lake Erie is then connected to Lake Ontario, and you have or not connected, but can easily get there, and you have Canada. So you can see the importance of this Erie Canal. Now, the nickname of the Erie Canal was called the Big Ditch, and it took about 8 years to build. It was dug pretty much by shovels, folks. Okay, it was dug by British immigrants, German immigrants, and a lot of Irish, mostly Irish to be quite honest. They earned about 80 cents a day. It was hard work. It took 8 years to build this. Okay, it took 8 years to build. A lot of time and a lot of effort went into this. But by doing so, you decreased the amount of money it took for people and for goods to get from, the East Coast all the way to Lake Erie, and then eventually, to the Midwest. Because it cut the time in half. If you were to go from from Albany to Buffalo, not using it, by using the canal, it cut that time in half. And because it was so successful, other people started to jump on board, and so you had about 3,600 miles of canals that were actually built during this time. And so a lot of times this is known as the Canal Era as well. Era of good feeling. This was a time of peace and prosperity and progress from 1815 to 1825. The war is over. War of 1812 is over. We are building. Things look good. We are proud. We start to have a national symbol in the bald eagle, and national unity is at a peak. People are happy for being American, and through the use of canals and roads, we are having progress. So it's a time of peace, prosperity, and progress. National unity also increased by 2 Supreme Court decisions. And what these Supreme Court decisions did is they strengthened the federal power. The first Supreme Court was McCulloch versus Maryland. And that allowed Congress to use implied powers. And if you remember, implied powers, that's our elastic clause. I can't spell, I'm sorry. Elastic clause. For the creation of a national bank. Now, I know that we've already talked a little bit about the national bank, but what happened in this case was that the Second National Bank of the United States was created. because we needed to help the economy after the War of 1812. Lots of states were anti this national bank again. And so some of these states started taxing the federal bank. And so the state of Maryland, first off, they started taxing these, and the bank refused to pay. They said, we are a national bank, remember? Remember when we studied the Constitution, the national bank and the national always outdoes the state. But some of these, the state of Maryland sued the bank, that was the national bank that was in Maryland, and said, hey, you need to pay. You need to pay. And so if we look at this little cartoon here, McCulloch versus Maryland, this little kid down here would be Maryland. And he says, hey, the 10th Amendment, which remember the 10th Amendment says states have the power to make decisions if it's not done by the federal government, says, Dad, I got to tax you here. And Dad, the national bank saying, no, you don't. I have the supremacy clause, which means, the supremacy, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the elastic clause, which allows me to do that. And it says, son, not only is it necessary, but you don't know who your daddy is. In other words, the national government has that power over a state, over the states, and so they are not allowed to tax a bank, a national bank, I should say. And so it was decided upon. The vote was 7-0, and that basically the national bank was constitutional, and that state banks could not do that. Another case is known as Gibbons versus Ogden, and it said that states could not interfere with Congress to regulate interstate trade. And what happened here was that there were steamboat operators who wanted to travel on New York waters. And to do that, you had to obtain a state license. Well, this guy named Thomas Gibbons, he already had a federal license that allowed him to travel at New York. And he wanted to do that, and he wanted to travel, and he wanted to compete against a guy named Aaron Ogden. But New York would not let him travel because he did not have a state license. And he's trying to say, hold up, I have a federal license. That should outdo the state license. If we look, here we go. Here's Gibbons versus Ogden. He's saying, New York saying, this is our river. You have to have a New York license. And, Ogden is saying that, actually these should be switched. Ooh, let's go back. I apologize here. That this is the Hudson River, remember we talked about in New York, that, hey, I have a federal license. I should be able to do this. I shouldn't have to get your state license. And so the case was actually decided upon that it was 6-0 that ruled in favor of Gibbons, saying that Gibbons' federal license took priority over the state license that Ogden had. And so it also talked about that commerce, trade is more than just literally goods, but it includes people, and it also includes new inventions like steamboats. Now, the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise started because of regional differences or regional conflicts, and this is that idea of sectionalism or disagreements between between different regions. In other words, I'm not going to look out for what's best for my country. I'm going to look out, I'm from the North, I want to do what's best for the North, or I want to do what's best for the South. And so what happens to start this all is, Missouri. Missouri is ready to become a state. It wants to be a slave state. The problem with doing that is that it is going to upset the balance. Okay, if we look here at the balance, we have 11, if you look here, the green states are free states. We have 11 free states, and we have 11 slave states. So if Missouri comes in as a slave state, that makes it 12-11. That upsets the balance in Congress, and that is not good. And so they, the northern states did not want that to happen. And so the first compromise, which said this, compromise said that Missouri should come in as a slave state. That was fine. But the North said there were no more importing slaves, and you had to set free all of the children of Missouri slave owners. So those Missouri slaves that had kids had to be set free. Well, that was rejected. The South said no. So Henry Clay, remember I told you, he is known as the Great Compromiser. Henry Clay comes up with his idea, and that's called the Missouri Compromise. It's a three-parter. It says that Missouri would enter as a slave state. Now, to balance that, Maine would come in as a free state. And so that would keep that balance. Now, probably the most important of the three is this one right here, is this idea that slavery would be prohibited. In other words, not allowed, okay, in any new territories or states north of 3630. Okay, north of 3630. Now, if we look at this graphic here, you can see, maybe not, sorry, I need to go back and get it for you. Sorry, technical difficulties. If we look at this, here, Missouri, even though this is that 3630 line, Missouri is north of it. But the deal was, that's okay. Missouri would come in as a slave state. Maine would come in as a free state. Then, anything north of this land, so all of this right here, if any time these guys wanted to come in as a state, or even now, there is no slavery allowed here. No slavery allowed. Now, from anything south of it, this could be slavery. Now, at this point where I just wrote, that's now not part of the United States yet. That's still Spanish Mexico. But anything through here, this would be allowed to have slavery. Now, they were hoping that this actually would solve this crisis here of what's going to happen. But the disagreement over the North and South slavery is going to continue. And, I mean, you know that this is one of the reasons the Civil War happens, is this idea of slavery. And so while this is a compromise, it isn't an end-all, be-all. It doesn't solve everything. It just kind of lets Missouri come in, lets Maine come in, and then it makes a decision. What you're going to find out later on is, as we watch in more chapters, people aren't going to listen to that Missouri Compromise, and they're going to end up overruling it in multiple ways. So that is Chapter 9, Section 2, dealing with nationalism, that first ism, pride within our nation, and sectionalism, which kind of goes opposite. We're not all about our nation. We're all about what's best for our area of the country. So I hope that you were able to get those questions answered. If not, remember, you can go back and go back. You can watch it again. You can stop if you need to, and pause and go back. But I look forward to seeing you guys all on Monday.